All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's InCHIP lecture, where I am very glad that we are joined by Dr. Tiffany L. Carson, who I know will give a very interesting presentation on her work. As an introduction, and I'm Dr. Lonica Blackman Carr from the Department of Nutrition at UConn. And to give you a little bit of background on Dr. Carson, she is an associate member and the George Edgecombe Endowed Scholar in the Department of Health Outcomes and Behavior in the Division of Population Sciences at Moffitt Cancer Center. Dr. Carson completed her bachelor's degree at Florida State University. She later received her master's degree and PhD in epidemiology at the University of Alabama at Birmingham and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Arkansas for medical sciences. As an applied epidemiologist, Dr. Carson has a breadth of research experience with a central theme of population-based, biobehavioral, observational, and intervention studies for obesity treatment and cancer prevention. Dr. Carson is currently the principal investigator of two NIH-funded RO1 studies investigating behavioral and biological aspects of weight management, cancer prevention, and health disparities. Dr. Carson has published in multiple peer-reviewed journals, including Obesity, Psychosomatic Medicine, and JAMA. In addition, in addition to her research portfolio, Dr. Carson has nearly a decade of experience mentoring early stage scientists, something that I know is very valuable to the field and to those scientists individually. As she gives her presentation, please hold all questions until the end. We will have a moderated Q&A portion. So without further ado, I welcome Dr. Carson to the table and screen. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for the warm welcome. And I would like to thank the entire group for the invitation to present today. We were talking as we were preparing for the session and just how, this virtual technology allows us to connect with more people and be in more places. And so I am so glad to have the opportunity to share some of my work today and connect with a few of you who are doing incredible work that I've followed and admired for quite a while. So today, my talk will primarily focus on psychological factors associated with weight maintenance, weight management among Black women, with a primary focus on the role of stress in weight management. And so as a brief outline, what we'll do with today's talk is I'll start with a brief review of the epidemiology of obesity in the US, and then follow that with a definition of stress. After that, we'll take a little bit of time and really examine what we know about the relationship between stress and weight, both observationally as well as in the context of behavioral weight loss interventions. I'll share a little bit of work that I've been involved in this space over many years at this point. And then to conclude, I'll briefly talk a little bit about the potential physiologic impacts of stress on the body, with a primary focus on the gut microbiota, another area of my research program. And I think at the end of that, we should still have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So here we have the CDC map that I'm sure many on this call are very familiar with. This illustrates the prevalence of self-reported obesity among U.S. adults across the U.S. This is defined by state, with the darker colors really representing the areas with the highest obesity prevalence. You see this deep dark red color here represents 35% or greater prevalence of obesity within these states. According to the most recent CDC data, we know that more than 40% of adults are affected with obesity. We also know that obesity is not evenly distributed by geography, by race, by sex, and so there are different groups that bear disproportionate burdens. As you can see from this map, the Southeast region, particularly Alabama and Arkansas, where a lot of this work has taken place, rank in that highest category. Looking up here in your neck of the woods, the color is a little lighter, but don't get too excited just yet. So I wanted to also share the most recent map from CDC as I was sort of preparing and updating slides for this talk. And this is the 2020 map. And one thing that struck me about this map is that they've added some additional color categories here. And so, whereas that highest category was greater than 35%, now we see that the highest category is greater than 40%, which is essentially in response to the trajectory of obesity in our country. This map doesn't show any states with that highest category as of yet when we look at all individuals in aggregate. But as I said, obesity is not equally experienced by racial groups, for example. So this map focuses specifically on Black United States adults, and we can see that many of the states, particularly in the East, have that higher prevalence of 40% or greater of obesity among adult Black US residents. Again, looking here in Alabama and Arkansas, where a lot of the work happened, that highest category, significant numbers here in Florida, where I'm currently working with similar populations, and the same here when we even look in your neck of the woods. Additionally, when we include overweight, data suggests that about 80% really of Black women are overweight or have obesity. And we also know that Black women tend to suffer from a disproportionate burden of morbidity and mortality in obesity-associated diseases. And so this is something important to note, to understand, to document, because there are health consequences associated with obesity. And here's just a smattering of them shown on this slide. People who have obesity compared to those with a healthy weight are at increased risk for many serious diseases and health conditions. The top row sort of shows our typical cardiovascular conditions that we think about with obesity, so hypertension, dyslipidemia, type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease, and stroke. But there are other conditions that are also consequences of obesity, like gallbladder disease, osteoarthritis, sleeping and breathing problems. Particularly with the work that I'm doing at Moffitt, there are a number of cancers that are associated with obesity as well. I think at this point, the number is about 13 different cancers with some evidence of being associated with obesity. Also, as it relates to just quality of life, mental health, bodily pain, physical functioning, all of these outcomes are associated with obesity, and then, of course, mortality. And so, when talking about weight management among Black women in particular, there really are a couple of things that we have to consider. It really is this multi pronged challenge, given that Black women have a higher prevalence of obesity than any other group in the country, and that Black women tend to lose less weight when attempting weight loss through a variety of treatment modalities. And the reasons for this really still are not fully understood, and really just suggests that additional work is needed to further understand weight management among Black women. And so, for everyone, obesity is complicated. There are a lot of contributors to obesity. There are a number of factors that play a role in weight management. And so, this infographic was actually published by the Obesity Society back in 2015. It really aimed to list and organize all of the different potential contributors to energy storage by either impacting energy intake, expenditure, or both. And the contributors are really organized based on whether they are happening inside the person, and these are the things that we think to be more physiologic in nature, or things that happen outside the person, and these are more of our social determinants, psychological factors, and environmental factors. And since we know that race is a social construct and not a biological construct or a biological factor, we might expect that many of the things that drive racial disparities in health, and in this case, in obesity, are things happening on the right side of this slide, these social, environmental, and behavioral factors. And even when we sort of divide the slide in half, it's still a lot of factors here to consider. No one researcher or research program can look at all of these things at once. But for the purpose of today's talk, I will focus primarily on the role of stress in weight management. And so, to have an operationalized definition of stress, researchers have defined stress as an uncomfortable emotional experience accompanied by biochemical, physiological, and behavioral changes. But whenever I talk about stress, I like to highlight that stress is not inherently bad. So, in fact, stress is really the body's response to stressors. Um, the body's response to stressors is really a survival mechanism that helps the brain, it helps the heart to really react to overcome stressors. However, as you can imagine, it's sort of this prolonged exposure to stress that really becomes problematic and throws some of our regulatory systems out of sync. And so we really tend to think of stress in two buckets. There's acute stress, which is really more of a specific event. It usually has a fixed time duration. So, for example, if there's a person who doesn't like public speaking and has to give a talk in front of an audience of 1,000 people, they might experience acute stress. And when that talk is over, things sort of go back to normal. Then there's chronic stress, and this is that type of stress that's just characterized by repeated exposures to situations that lead to release of stress hormones. And it's really this chronic stress that has been linked to adverse health. This might include ongoing financial stress, relationship stress. More recently, a lot of us are thinking more about discrimination and racism related stress as well for underrepresented racial and ethnic groups. And so, stress researchers have really characterized stressful events into a few large categories that you see listed here on the slide. There are your major life events, so that's like the loss of a loved one or exposure to violence or some natural disaster. But again, stress is not always related to something bad. So it could be a wedding or starting a new job, which is, a great life event, but it still can induce stress. There are also recent life events that focus on changes in the past year. This might include some of the things in the previous category, but it tends to be focusing on things that have happened more recently or new occurrences. Another category is life trauma. Now, this typically refers to things like childhood trauma or neglect or abuse. And these are things that have happened over the life course. And then the last category is perceived chronic stress and really can include stress related to any of these categories, with the key factor that it is ongoing and persistent. And another important thing, really, just to note about stress is that how an individual perceives the event and the importance that one assigns to the event really drives whether or not that individual experiences stress as a result of an exposure. So you can have two individuals to experience the same thing, but based on their lens, their perspectives, their experiences, they may or may not perceive the same level of stress associated with that exposure. And so we can't really talk about stress among Black women without really acknowledging and recognizing this cultural norm for Black women to exude strength no matter what. This is rooted in history. Scholars have now coined the term the Sojourner Syndrome or the Superwoman schema, and these are really concepts that are used to explain the phenomenon of this early onset morbidity among African American women, really in response to just persistent chronic stress and active coping that's associated with meeting sort of the day to day demands and responsibilities associated with multiple caregiver roles. And then when we think even further about how the health of Black women might be particularly vulnerable to stress, we also have to think about the additional challenges of this demographic group that really exists at the intersection of two groups that have been historically discriminated against. And so this intersectionality is an important concept that really increases the likelihood that Black women will experience discrimination either due to their race or sex or both. And research has shown that discrimination is associated with increased stress, increased depression, as well as increased adiposity, both directly and indirectly through stress and depression as mechanisms. So we have to be thoughtful about different forms of stress, different sources of stress, how we define those, and how they may apply across different racial, ethnic, and gender groups. So now that we've reviewed the data on obesity, we've defined stress, I want to move forward and start bringing these two areas together. I think we can all sort of anecdotally think about individuals whose body weights respond differently to stress, right? So we know some people who, when they are stressed or get stressed out, they tend to lose weight. We know some people that when they're stressed, they tend to gain weight, and so a better understanding is sort of needed as to what drives that. But before even getting to that, I thought it was important to really sort of see what we know from the literature about this relationship and what the data might suggest. So, one of the first large cohort studies in the US to really examine the relationship between psychosocial stress and weight, it was published in 2009 in the American Journal of Epidemiology, and it was using data from the Midlife in the United States study. So, this study included a nationally representative cohort of adults from age 25 to 74. Um, they completed a telephone survey to assess psychosocial factors that influence physical and mental health for adults in midlife. And this study really included a focus on stressors related to work, personal relationships, life constraints, and finances. And participants were followed for 9 years. So, in this cohort of a little over 1,350 participants, over half were females, and of females, about 10% were Black. This study really focused primarily on gender comparison, so we really can't glean much about racial subgroups from this analysis. However, these researchers did report that women had higher levels of baseline stress than men. Another interesting finding was that baseline stress was associated with weight gain over time only among participants with higher BMIs at baseline. And this is really true for men and women. So this really means that among individuals with lower BMIs, there was not an association between stress and weight gain. And then they also saw that the relationship between stress and weight gain existed across more domains of stress for women compared to men. And really, when focusing on men, the relationships between weight and stress were only true as it related to work and finances. So, this goes back to this concept of different exposures across different racial and ethnic groups may have differential impacts. And so, since then, and there have been several observational studies published reporting on the associations between stress and weight. Quite honestly, the findings have been inconsistent in some cases, but there have been a couple of nice papers that have really synthesized the findings of this work so far. So there was a meta-analysis published back in 2011 that included 14 studies looking at the association between stress and weight gain just observationally. As I said, there were some inconsistencies in the findings, but the meta-analysis did conclude that psychosocial stress was associated with at least a small effect or a small risk for weight gain. They also saw more positive associations between stress and weight change than negative associations. And then another more recent paper in Obesity Reviews really set out to review more recent reports in this area and just add on to this work. So this review paper included 12 new studies and really drew conclusions that were similar to that of the 2011 meta-analysis, that there was an association between stress and weight change over time. This paper also delved into discussing that the higher risk for stress-related weight gain is due to um, both physiologic and behavioral processes, and really that exposure to the stressor activates the HPA axis, the sympathetic nervous system, and negative affect, which are all linked to emotional eating and other behaviors. So that sort of starts to get into this biobehavioral model. And so from at least those meta-analyses, the previous reports of what we know, let's just conclude for now that stress is associated with at least some weight gain over time in the free living population. But I want to emphasize these were observational studies. There was no weight-focused intervention, just sort of a association study over time to see what the relationship between stress and weight looks like over time. So, to sort of build on that, for the next step, I want us to start looking at the role of stress as it's associated with weight loss outcomes among participants in behavioral weight loss interventions. And so one of the first studies looking at this among a racially diverse US population is reported in 2009 in a publication in, I think this is Health Psychology. Um, and so in this study, they really examined whether baseline stress was associated with weight loss outcomes among a sample of women with overweight with type 2 diabetes who were participating in a 6-month behavioral weight loss program. Stress was measured using the perceived stress scale. This is a common measure used to assess perceived global stress, and you'll hear it a few more times as I start to present my work. And so in this study, they reported that baseline stress was inversely associated with weight loss, meaning that individuals with higher stress at baseline lost less weight at 6 months. Here we have a figure from the paper also illustrating this when stress category was divided into tertiles. As you can see, participants in the highest stress category, indicated by this score of 22 or greater, lost about 2 kilograms less than this lowest stress tertile. And that difference was statistically significant. They also conducted sensitivity analysis to compare the program completers to dropouts and saw that higher stress was reported among dropouts compared to completers. And given what we already know from the behavioral weight loss intervention literature, we know that adherence and attendance is linked to outcomes. So it's important to recognize that maybe this high level of stress impacted adherence and attendance, which could ultimately impact outcomes. There have been several other published studies reporting a similar relationship when looking at baseline stress and interventions over time. But in full transparency, again, the findings are sort of inconsistent, and we can talk a little bit about why that might be. And so, along these same lines, our research team wanted to examine a similar question in an exclusively Black sample of females in a behavioral weight loss program. So I was fortunate to join a team that was already conducting a large-scale cluster randomized behavioral weight loss intervention for cancer prevention and control. This was at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And so as a part of this larger intervention, I was able to collect additional data and really take the opportunity to examine the relationships between stress and weight loss outcomes. And so I'll start by giving you a little bit of background about the main study and outcomes from that, but I mostly want to focus on the secondary analysis that focused on these psychosocial measures. So the main study was a 2-year cluster randomized trial in which 409 women across 8 counties in Alabama and Mississippi were randomized at the county level to receive either a 24-month behavioral weight loss intervention augmented with support for community strategies to promote healthy living, or they receive that same behavioral weight loss program alone without the support for community strategies. To be eligible, participants had to live, work, or worship in one of our research counties, self-report as a Black female, be between the ages of 30 to 70, and be overweight or have obesity. And so the sort of really innovative piece of the parent grant was really this multi-level approach of incorporating support for community strategies into the behavioral weight loss intervention. But the other really unique element was that all of the sessions were led by trained lay community health advisors and staff. And so, we were excited to see how this turns out because there could be implications in terms of long-term sustainability and future implementation of similar programs. And so for this study, participants were in their mid-40s. Over 60% of participants reported a total annual household income of $30,000 or less. A similar proportion reported some education beyond high school, and just over half of the participants reported being single. And so again, the main results paper reporting on weight loss and change in metabolic markers at 6 months is published in the Journal of Internal Medicine for those who really want the nitty-gritty details of the parent study. In brief, the average participant weight loss was about 3 kilograms at 6 months. This weight loss is pretty comparable to what's been achieved for a lot of weight loss studies for Black women, including those that are in professionally led weight loss trials, even though this was delivered in the community by lay community members. So we were excited about the potential for this to suggest a viable model for future work. We also looked at weight losses of 3 and 5% body weight, since these markers are deemed to be clinically meaningful. And we saw that about 40% achieved at least 3% of loss of their baseline weight, and about a quarter achieved 5%. And so using that larger behavioral weight loss intervention, again, I took the opportunity to really explore the role of stress among those same participants. And so the initial research question focused on whether baseline stress predicted weight loss among this sample of exclusively Black women, whether our outcomes will be similar to what was observed in the study, the 2009 study that I described before. From our analysis, we did not see any direct association between baseline stress and weight change among this population. We had a number of psychosocial measures we included, so we also examined depression as an exploratory question and saw no association between baseline depression and weight loss either. However, we did see that a change in depression score over time was positively associated with change in weight. So those who had greater improvements in depression also lost more weight. And so also along these lines and thinking about just stress and wellness and weight loss programs, I was a part of another project. And this question about the impact of stress on participation and outcomes in weight loss studies was another sort of theme that emerged during this work. So this was a worksite wellness behavioral weight loss program for women at a predominantly Black worksite in Birmingham, Alabama. This was a 30-week program that was culturally adapted from the medical weight loss program that was offered at UA at the time. And for this study, again, weight change was the primary outcome of focus for the main study. But what immediately jumped out to me was the high number of life stressors that we heard about from our participants in a relatively short period of time. Now, this was not an a priori research question. It's not something that we systematically collected, but there were enough events to trigger us to go ahead and conduct some follow-up semi-structured interviews to really get a representative sample and learn more about how the participants thought that the stressors might have affected their participation in the weight loss program. And so what we found from those semi-structured interviews among those who lost weight, they talked a lot about how stress, those who lost less weight, I should say, talked about how stress kept them from fully engaging in the program, that their life events took priority over weight loss. And so they really didn't achieve the weight loss outcomes that they wanted. However, when we talked to those who lost more weight, they talked about how they were able to use strategies that they learned as a part of the weight loss intervention to manage their stress. And so this really sort of stimulated the question of whether there's an opportunity to create some synergy between these behavioral interventions that might lead to both improved management of stress and improved management of weight. So, from sort of piecing all of these things together, finally sort of refined a question of whether adding a strong stress management component to a behavioral weight loss program would improve weight loss outcomes. And so to start to explore this line of work, I worked with a team who conducted a pilot study to really explore stress management and weight control among Black women. This study was called Renew. This was during my time at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. Renew was able to enroll 44 participants who met the following criteria. Again, they had to identify as Black women, have elevated stress levels based upon an entry screening survey, were in the age range of 25 to 45 years old and have a BMI of greater than 25. So from that point, eligible participants were randomized to either a 12-week evidence-based weight loss intervention plus strategies for stress management, or the 12-week intervention alone. And the intervention was based on the Diabetes Prevention Program Intensive Lifestyle intervention arm, which has produced some of the largest weight losses achieved by Black women in behavioral weight loss interventions to date. And so here's a very brief description of the intervention components for Renew, right, that were common to both arms. Both conditions consisted of 60-minute sessions with Black master's level trained counselors to have racial concordance. Participants were given fat and calorie goals based on their starting weights to promote 3 to 5% weight loss. Everyone was advised to increase their moderate physical activity with an eventual goal of 200 minutes per week. And then self-monitoring was another vital component for both groups. Now, in addition to these components shared across both groups, those who were randomized to the lifestyle plus stress management group also received training in stress management strategies. And these included relaxation techniques like guided relaxation, diaphragmatic breathing, mindfulness. They also received training in some behavioral strategies like time management, or even using distractions to help manage stress. And then also some training in cognitive approaches for stress management. So challenging dichotomous thinking, positive affirmations, things of that nature that have been shown in the literature to lead to some reduction in stress. The primary outcome of interest for this study was change in body weight. We're also interested in looking at changes in stress level as measured by the perceived stress scale, the instrument that I mentioned before. This is a validated 10-item survey to assess perceived chronic stress. And then we also collected saliva to have an objective measure of stress in the form of salivary cortisol, and of course collected process data to be able to evaluate it as well. Here's a description of this study sample. Women were about 44 years old on average, had class 2 obesity. This study sample was fairly well educated, and there were not any significant differences in any of these factors by group. And so this table shows the results of our predetermined outcomes for Renew. The groups didn't display any statistically significant differences in outcomes. We might expect that given the sample size and that it really wasn't powered to as a pilot. But we were encouraged by some of the trends that we saw. So for example, participants in the lifestyle plus stress group lost about twice as much weight as those in the lifestyle only group. We did not really see any differences in perceived stress scale scores, but in looking at cortisol, we also saw greater reductions in cortisol among those who were in the lifestyle plus stress management group compared to lifestyle alone. We did not see any differences across our groups as it relates to these adherence measures in terms of the number of sessions they attended or diaries that were submitted. So again, some promising trends. This work was encouraging in terms of thinking about stress as a potential mechanism to help improve weight loss outcomes. And so to continue to build on this, I started to think about how we could further refine this intervention, particularly for Black women who, again, I hope I convinced you at the beginning, have sort of a unique stress experience. And so to prepare for that, we decided to do some formative work to really dig down and understand what stressors affect Black women and how Black women perceive those stressors and the role that those stressors may play in their weight management. And so we took a systematic approach to really think about adapting the intervention. As a first step in the approach, we conducted highly structured focus groups or nominal group technique to really draw on the experience of the members of our target population. We conducted 3 groups that ended up including a total of 33 women. And these participants were asked the 3 questions that are here. So what are the top sources of stress for women? And then what stressors relate specifically to being a Black woman? And then in what ways do these stressors influence women's weight? We compiled the data, we conducted a formal distillation process, and here is just sort of a sample of some of the things that we learned during this work. And the results of this qualitative assessment are actually, I think, now published in Journal of Women's Health, or should be out pretty soon if anyone would get more details. But here's just a quick sort of sample of some of the things we found. So in looking at this first question of what are the top sources of stress for women, we heard responses like taking care of everyone, or advancing in my career, or women don't get the same chances as men, paying for college as a single mother, trying to be in a good, happy relationship. But when we focused in more and talked about stressors related specifically to Black women, the responses changed a little bit. So we heard things like child care as a single parent, job discrimination, and being the only Black woman in the office. I'm always worried about safety, raising Black boys and being married to a Black man. And just to provide some context, some of these groups were happening, in around the time when we were having what seemed to be an uptick in at least awareness about a lot of the racial and social unrest and injustice in our country. And so that was certainly at the forefront of the brain of many of our participants. Not making as much money on jobs as men or white women. And then when we talked about how these things affect weight, there's no time to eat right because I do for everyone else. Being healthy is expensive and hard for people with limited money. So this gives you a snapshot of sort of the things that they perceive as stressors and barriers to weight management. Those responses were distilled into these themes and sort of grouped this way related to daily caregiver stress, work stress, stigma, discrimination and bias, financial stress, and relational stress. And so then based on, what we know from the literature, as well as consults with the investigative team and an advisory board, we put together a list of approaches that we propose to sort of directly address these stressors with some additional tailoring to the unique stressor and some cultural tailoring. So for example, in caregiver stress, we talked about things related to self-care like massage. We talked about time management. We also talked about social support and collective, which is historically a value in the Black community and something that might be of interest or relevance for our participants. If we drop down and look at stigma or discrimination or bias, we thought stress management strategies would not only be sort of positive affirmations, but with a intentional focus on pride in one's race and sex as a Black woman. Similar thoughts for culturally tailoring things related to guided imagery. And so to actually do this work, to develop and test the intervention, we received R01 funding in 2020 to test this in a full-scale randomized trial. The government name for the trial is here: Improving Weight Loss Outcomes of Black Women Using a Culturally Relevant Stress Management Enhanced Behavioral Weight Loss Intervention. And this work is supported by the NIDDK. Our short name, our internal name for participants, and sort of, to discuss it as a team, is Reset. And this is our Reset logo. And so the research question for Reset, again, is: does adding a culturally tailored stress management component to an evidence-based behavioral weight loss intervention produce greater weight loss than the standard intervention? And our hypothesis is that this culturally targeted enhanced intervention will lead to improved weight loss and stress reduction. And so here I'll just give you sort of a sample of some of the handouts that are a part of this intervention. So the behavioral weight loss piece, again, is based on the diabetes prevention program. We've taken those materials, tried to enhance them a little bit, make them visually appealing. We've also done some surface tailoring to include images that are diverse and that represent the target population. So these are just some screenshots of some of the participant handouts that are our DPP adapted materials here. Then the sort of what we hope to be the special sauce, the stress management modules, were created and developed by our investigative team and our advisory board. And here again, we have a couple of snapshots of handouts that participants will receive. So again, we've done things to do some sort of surface level tailoring in terms of the images, the colors, et cetera, but also in terms of the topic and content that the interventionist will provide. Instead of just talking about meditation, we want to focus specifically on things that are culturally salient for Black women, like peace and spirituality and pride. And so here's a snapshot of the study overview. Participants will be screened. If determined to be eligible, they're randomized to the DPP plus stress management or the DPP plus women's health alone. And that's essentially meant to be attention control. So they just have important women's health topics that they review, and we provide them with a one-page handout that's publicly available to review those topics as well. Participants have weekly meetings for the first 4 months, biweekly meetings for the next 2 months, and then monthly meetings for the last 6 months. And we collect data at baseline months 4, 6, and 12. To participate, individuals have to self-identify as Black women with obesity. The age range is 21 to 75 years old, with elevated stress levels. Participants are excluded if they're pregnant, has a known condition that influences weight loss, if there's a psychiatric history of concern, or if weight loss is not supported by medical advice. So just give you a quick update on the progress with the RESET study. As I mentioned, it was funded in 2020. That was also the year that the pandemic sort of shut research operations down as we knew it. So we eventually made the decision to convert the program to be delivered virtually online, and participants meet via Zoom. Also, since that time, I relocated institutions, which threw us a little bit behind our timeline as well. I'm always happy when I can report that our first cohort is underway. They started in January of this year. And so we are actually now gearing up for our 4-month assessments for this project. We'll enroll another 3 cohorts of about 85 or so women, with the goal of reaching our target of 340 by the end of the funding period. Here's a quick snapshot of the measures that we'll collect at each time point. So we have our standard demographics, anthropometry, stress measurements, as well as blood glucose, energy, physical activity, and other psychosocial measures. And so for the last few minutes of the talk, I'll shift gears a little bit and talk about how stress actually gets under the skin, or how does stress enter the body. And I know a lot of what I presented so far has been mostly behavioral in nature, but there really is a solid body of evidence supporting that stress actually affects our body at a physiologic level, possibly even as far down as to the genetic level. And so, just as a little bit of physiology, our stress response is really mostly regulated by the HPA axis. And this is that primary neuroendocrine highway where our brain receives stress signals through our senses, and then the brain sort of interprets those signals, converts them into neurotransmitters and hormones that really are then delivered to the proper organ to emit whatever is the further needed action. So this is how the brain is on high alert, or the heart is ready to pump more blood, whatever the body needs to do in times of threat or while experiencing symptoms of stress. Again, that's a good protective measure that our body has, but as you can imagine, sort of prolonged exposures to stress can lead to dysregulation of this system. That ultimately leads to inflammation, poor metabolism, and a number of other metabolic responses. And historically, the most common hormone that's been assessed as it relates to stress in the body is cortisol, which is released in this pathway. And we do collect that measure in a lot of the previous work and current work that I've described. But we are also now starting to think more about the impact of stress on other physiologic processes that might lead to morbidity. One area that's really sort of gaining some traction here is the role of stress and the gut microbiota. There's been some interesting work, certainly in terms of how the gut microbiota of mice change when exposed to stress. it's not clear at this point how that translates to humans. But I will share a little bit of work that my team has done in that topic area. Um, so again, the focus here is the gut microbiota, which really just describes the bacterial inhabitants of the gut. The gut bacteria, gut microbiota have been associated with a number of chronic diseases, including obesity and colorectal cancer, which are the two areas that I focus on primarily, but there are others. We do know that the gut microbiota is largely influenced by birth, by diet, by physical activity, medications, as well as environment. The exciting thing is, at this point, the field is learning a lot about associations. I think the next step is getting a better understanding of the mechanisms, which could really then offer these targets for preventive or therapeutic treatment for a number of conditions. And so I'm particularly interested in whether there are racial differences in the gut microbial composition that may contribute to health disparities. And if so, what are the behavioral or environmental factors that sort of contribute to any observed differences by race? So particularly, I've explored whether dietary patterns are associated with these differences, as well as stress. The first study that I did to look at this, it was a pilot study funded by the Cancer Center at UAB, where we simply wanted to enroll about 100 generally healthy, cancer-free individuals to characterize and compare their gut microbiome with the focus on women and having a relatively even split in terms of race. Here, just quickly, the inclusion for the study had to be adult, non-Hispanic, Black, or white women with no major medical conditions and no antibiotic use in the previous 3 months. Participants provided us with stool samples, saliva samples, and blood samples, as well as a number of other survey measures. From this table describing our participants, you can see that Black women were older and had a higher average BMI than white women. Um, Sort of contrary to what's commonly seen in the literature and our work, white women actually reported higher scores on the weekly stress inventory. We didn't see any significant differences in race by total fiber or calories, and we wanted to look at these dietary elements because they have been widely associated with the gut microbiome in the literature. And so here we have the outcomes of the microbiome analysis. This table really just shows that there were not any significant racial differences in alpha diversity, which basically refers to the number of different types of bugs in the gut. However, this PCOA plot and this p-value here is associated with beta diversity, which really describes the distribution of bugs in the gut. And here we do see some significant differences. We also see that white women, who are represented by the green marks, are more tightly clustered together than Black women, suggesting that their gut microbiota are more similar to one another than Black women. Some other interesting things we saw. So, after controlling for a number of suspected confounders, Black women still displayed a greater abundance of bacteroids, which is of interest in the colorectal cancer community. That taxa tends to be overrepresented among individuals with colorectal cancer. We also saw that stress was associated with multiple different taxa in our exploratory analysis that have some pathogenic properties based on the literature. And then we also saw that diet quality was associated with diversity and abundance of microbes. And so, further building out this microbiome work and thinking about how we can potentially modify the microbiome to be healthier across populations, I proposed a study to look at the impact of different dietary patterns on the gut microbiota of a racially diverse sample of adults living in the US who are otherwise generally healthy. And so that study we call the dining study, or the DASH intervention to investigate the gut. And that's a little hint that we are looking at the impact of the DASH dietary pattern compared to the standard American diet. And so our goal again here is to really explore the effects of the DASH diet on the gut microbiota and other physiologic markers, with the hypothesis that the DASH diet will lead to improvements in the gut microbiota that will be associated with lower risk for colorectal cancer compared to the standard American diet. So this study is also currently very close to being underway. We are doing our baseline assessments here for our very first wave. So we literally are here on the figure. Participants who are successfully enrolled will receive a 1-week run-in diet. That's the standard American diet, to try to sort of harmonize everyone at the same level before being randomized to either the DASH dietary pattern or the standard American diet. Participants will be provided with all of their meals, everything we want them to consume for the study, for a 5-week period. Well, so the 5 weeks includes the run-in, but also this 4-week period after they've been randomized. They will come to us every day to get their food and step on a scale so that we can monitor their weight. They'll also provide us with stool samples on a weekly basis so that we can look at changes in the microbiome over time. And then after that 5-week feeding period, we'll basically tell them that they can return to whatever dietary pattern they choose. We'll continue to collect some follow-up information then as well, just to enable us to understand how quickly the gut microbiome may revert after dietary changes happen. The inclusion and exclusion criteria for this study are similar to the study before. We'll collect a number of study measures here as well, both body measurements, a number of biospecimen samples, as well as surveys, dietary recall. So there will be hopefully a wealth of data for me to come back and share with you based on what we learn from this work. So as I mentioned, we are about to start this study. We'll have our first wave of participants to begin their feeding in just a few weeks. And so to conclude, hopefully I've left a little bit of time for questions, but a few take-home points. I know it's a lot of information. I think we need to remember that studies do suggest that stress is associated with weight gain over time if unchecked, and even in behavioral weight loss interventions, that higher stress is related to poor outcomes. We know that Black women historically report higher chronic stress, which might be contributing to weight management. We also know that the integration of focused stress management into current evidence behavioral weight loss trials might improve outcomes. So we hope to have some more definitive findings at the end of RESET. And then lastly, in thinking about sort of the biobehavioral model, there's certainly a lot of additional work to be done to understand how diet, stress, and the gut microbiome might interact to contribute to risk for a number of chronic diseases, as well as a contributor to health disparities. So it has taken an army of people to do this work over a lot of time. So I do want to acknowledge research teams at UAB, UAMS, and now at Moffitt Cancer Center. Also want to acknowledge all the funding agencies, NIDDK and NCI, as well as the O'Neill Comprehensive Cancer Center at UAB. And that's it. So now there is certainly a little time for questions, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Carson, for taking the time to give us this wonderful talk. Certainly very interesting. We greatly appreciate you. And now we invite everyone to bring your questions. We have just a few minutes, but we invite you to bring your questions on the chat, or you can use the raise hand function. I see somebody already. I believe you should be able to unmute yourself and bring your question.
Hi, I'm Nancy Redeker. I'll be new to UConn in a week or so, and I'm very interested in sleep and proposing some work in Black women of childbearing age. Wondered if in all your work, obviously stress is closely related to sleep is closely related to our weight management, stress, and other things, and wondered if you've had any observations or data on that.
Hi, Nancy. Thank you for the question. Honestly, personally, in my work, I haven't. It's from the figure that I put up at first about all the different contributors, there's just so many things that I've tried really hard to focus in on a couple of key factors. But I have certainly been in rooms and been a part of conversations where, it's clear that stress needs to be a part of sleep needs to be a part of our model when we think about potential links between stress and obesity. And then I think I heard you say that you are doing this work in mothers or new mothers. Is that correct?
Actually, I'm interested in women of childbearing age, and it's very, that's an interesting slippery slope because the things I want to study change a lot over pregnancy. So, yeah, I mean, but youngish, to address it at the point where we can prevent some long-term risk.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a very important contributor. It's just one that I have not created the space to look at.
You can't look at everything. I get it.
Right,
Yeah, yeah.
right. But if you need some collaborators, I've got some folks for you who I know are very interested in this and would want to do some of that work. So I'm happy to pass their names along.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. I think we have one question, time for one more question. Okay, there's somebody in the chat.
I was also going to jump in here for a second, but I had a quick question. I really enjoyed that talk, and I really appreciated your thoughtful approach of how you developed your intervention, getting the epi piece, and then the qualitative data to then build what you're doing. I think it's a struggle for our field about what level to intervene at always. And so obesity and a lot of those causes are outside of the individual. And then our interventions tend to focus, on the individual and what they can do. So I was curious from your study that had the community engagement piece, and I'm not as familiar with those intervention components, if there was anything from there that you thought about retaining in the more individually focused stress management intervention that you're testing now, or is that something you might come back to in the future?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I didn't talk a lot about what those community strategies were, but there were certainly some things related to creating opportunities to buy healthier foods, like through voucher programs with partnerships of local vendors, creating safe spaces for activity. I know, like one community, they use their resources to build like a walking trail, and so I think you're spot on in that it really takes multi-level approaches to even have a chance at bending the curve. And a lot of the work really has focused on individual level factors, my work included. But certainly, in the future, I've been giving more thought to this lately, both in context of your question and then the question that I saw come up in the chat about weight regain, which is another huge problem in this area. And it's almost unfair to put the burden only at the individual level to achieve and maintain a healthy weight in its current environment. So I definitely have been thinking a lot more going forward about multi-level interventions, policy needs, to at least put individuals in environments where they can be successful. So
Thank you. I think we're going to stop right here with the questions. But just to let everybody know, this talk will be available on our YouTube channel. You just put InCHIP and the lecture series should come up. So if you have any questions there, I'm sure you can drop them there, or you can email us and we can try to work with Dr. Carson and see if we can get answers for those questions. But again, I just want to thank you, Dr. Carson, for taking your time for this wonderful talk. Again, we greatly appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. And on behalf of InCHIP, I also thank everybody who showed up, and we hope to see you on the next talk.
awesome. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks.